Please report that light working. It does lighten my face up enormously. Please report that.
Good afternoon, everyone. You are all here for the first session of this talk on Zen Garden, the series that we would be commencing today with Alan Clements, who is with us today from Cascades Gardens. So a bit about Alan before we start. Having had a corporate career spanning for more than 55 years, Alan was inspired by Buddhism and Buddhist practice, having met the Dalai Lama. And after his retirement, he has devoted his life to Zen gardening, developing what is now Cascades Gardens, which is an award-winning garden based in Derbyshire. Alan was introduced to us by the chair of the Dharma Center, Ricky, and Alan and Ricky share a strong friendship spanning for decades. Alan, I am very happy to have you here, and I am very, very eager and interested to see where this series takes us. And I should also let you know that we have some gardeners here who also have some award-winning gardens themselves. So I think they might find this session quite interesting as well. Now, before we carry on and I hand over the reins to Alan to continue with the talk, we will be having time for question and answers. If you can put down your questions onto the general chat, and we will address them to Alan, or you can also unmute yourself during the time of the question and answer session and then address whatever questions, suggestions, and anything that you would like to discuss with Alan and the rest of the group at that time. So thank you very much. And Alan, over to you.
Well, hello everyone. This is Alan Clements, as you've heard, from Cascades Gardens in Matlock in Derbyshire, UK. My talk is The Garden is My Teacher, and what I want to do is just tell you a little bit about my background and how I've turned from businessman to gardener and the journey that it's been developing the garden over 25 years. I've learned a lot of lessons in those 60 years actually of gardening, but 25 years of particularly working with this old limestone quarry at the back of my house, which we've converted to a garden. Lots of lessons. Certainly I found it a very healthy experience. I've learned about impermanence and how everything is very uncertain. I've had to develop patience and a responsibility for nature because we've tried to be organic. But overall, it's been a very creative experience. And I've got very close to nature and felt a very good peace of mind as a result as the garden has developed. It's worth just mentioning that all the pictures you'll see today are actually from the gardens. Well, as a businessman for 50 years, racing around the world, I had offices in China and so on, but long haul flights working with Unilever. But I have to say, by the time I got to my mid-60s, I was pretty fed up with my business life and a little bit tired of chasing profit. Well, it was also very competitive at some times of my life, and I didn't enjoy the politics of business. Always in the background, my hobby, gardening and the development of Cascades Gardens was there, and I wanted at one point when I retired to then convert the garden into a small business, let the general public in, and it's been fascinating meeting so many interesting people who wanted to come to this garden that's inspired by Japanese gardens and Buddhist philosophy. One thing for sure is that I find it much more relaxing. And I've discovered, well, unlike business, plants don't fight back. Well, Cascades started in 1830, and here is a watercolor that was done in 1830 by an Australian artist, which I found on the internet. The cottage next door to Cascades started in about 1750, and the smaller building in the front with the huge wheel was the early stages of Cascades before it was rebuilt later. So it was a huge water wheel, water coming down the hillside, a small mill grinding corn. Well, this is what the building looks like now, quite different. So from the early days of 1800 as a corn mill, it stopped milling around the mid 1800s. I suppose it became uneconomic. They sold off all the bits, the wheels and so on, and the grinding, there's some grinding wheels still in the garden, these big slabs of stone. And then someone came over, took it over and rebuilt the building as a rather elegant Victorian house in 1887. Well, in the land nearby, the house was 2 acres of a limestone quarry. You can see on the right-hand side there some of the cliff that had been worked for limestone. We also had an exploratory lead mine, which you see on the left. It's a tunnel that goes about 150 feet. It's quite fun to explore, although you have to mind your head. It's really quite low. I think miners must have been shorter people in 1800. Well, I don't know whether you follow Monty Don here in the UK, one of the famous gardeners that we have, but one thing that's always stuck in my mind from one of his talks is that actually a garden is not a place, it's a journey. And certainly that's what we've experienced here in Cascades. But the journey started in a little monastery tucked in the mountains of northwest Japan called Ehiji. And I was lucky enough to spend some time there in 1996 before I bought Cascades, getting instruction on Soto Zen meditation, which I found absolutely fascinating. I was the only Westerner there. It was a lovely monastery in a woodland setting. You can see the pictures there that I took. And it was a most glorious experience. Even the meditation, they made me get up at 3 o'clock in the morning. Mr. Clements, we're ready for your meditation. And we would line up against the wall and the friendly priest would thwack you on the shoulder if you wanted to loosen your shoulders and stay awake. Well, this is the first view I had of Cascades Gardens. It was a long 2-acre valley with a cliff on one side, 100 foot high, and 150-year-old yews and beeches on the right-hand side. So it was almost like a a gorge or a tunnel, completely overgrown. Actually, there was about an acre of hogweed, that nasty weed that stings you if you get the sap on your fingers. And that was my first glimpse of Cascades. Well, that's what it looks like now from the top of the cliff. It's a bit different, isn't it? But it's taken 25 years. You can see we are alongside a road, but it's a very peaceful setting because of this being surrounded by trees and cliffs. It's a very sheltered spot. But there were no plants, no cliffs, no young trees or shrubs. So it was really starting from a blank canvas. But I always had this strong feeling of my trip in Japan, of visiting monastery gardens in Kyoto and Nara, the old cities. And I was fascinated by the different types of Zen gardening, not least the dry stone, rate gravel gardens, Karasansui, and yes, even the koi carp in the pools and the waterfalls and the lush lawns and clipped conifers. So I was fascinated by Japanese gardens, and I wanted to come back and start a garden that had the principles of Japanese gardens, even though I couldn't compete with the intense manicuring that the Japanese seem to do with their plants and the amazing control they have over their natural settings. This is the other end of the garden on a wet day. You can probably see we have a lot of water in Derbyshire, and a lot of waterfalls and streams and so on throughout the grounds. But my journey started really with trying to get enough plants to fill the better of the 4 acre plot. It was a 4 acre plot, 2 acres on the flat where we could start to grow and cultivate plants and trees and shrubs. And so the very first thing we had to do really was create a nursery. And I started by buying plants, and then gradually we multiplied those up. But you can see that we actually started with a waste piece of land, top left, turned it into an orchard, and then gradually it became the nursery. It's now a lovely courtyard for a cafe in the nursery. A long stretch of garden at the far end, now turning into wonderful borders of flowers around the pond. And rocky corners have turned into nice places to sit, and even pools of water with water dripping down the rocks. Central part of the garden, we started to introduce Japanese plants in pots. I particularly like the cryptomerias and of course the acers. We've tried to grow quite a few of them in pots, and they seem to like the climate here too. And gradually we started to put seats in the garden. Here's that one facing the Japanese pot garden, and quite a relaxing place. And even we've extended that area and tried our first Karasansui raked gravel garden. It's so new, I haven't had time to rake the patterns in the rocks and shingle there, but we're developing it. The central part of the garden began as a bare piece of grass. It then became our hosta bed, lots of hostas, lush green growth in the damp shade. And yes, we've just had a wonderful Buddha donated to us. And you can see my little daughter just enjoying its arrival. Well, 50 years of gardening and house renovation has certainly made me realize that gardens can really become a wonderful place to sit, relax, and meditate. I found it very rejuvenating, not least last year when I managed to break my neck and spine and I had to recover. And gradually, I've realized how wonderful nature is to heal and also to develop the mind, spiritual growth. And I feel I've really developed that aspect of my life thanks to the garden. So traveling around the world as I have all through the Himalayas and even Everest Base Camp, I've seen some of the world's most spectacular natural landscapes. And I think this and my gardening has really helped me understand nature and our true nature. Well, I've done a lot of sitting. Zen Buddhism talks about sitting, and I've been able to look at the garden, watch the garden, see it develop, and it's dawned on me how beautiful nature is. But I've also learned a lot of lessons because you do experience a lot of things developing and growing, but also dying. The renewal of the garden every spring. But I've sensed this thing of harmony and balance. I think we get peace of mind from the wonderful harmony and balance of nature. We certainly have to be patient, and every day is different and you never quite know what the weather is going to do for you. All in all, I think nature is an amazing thing. It's wonderful and we should celebrate it. Well, let's look at my first lesson, really. It's all about health and conscious awareness. Why do we garden? I've often asked groups that I've talked to, well, why do you garden? What do you get out of gardening? And certainly some of the answers are about creation and creating something beautiful. Certainly this central part of Cascades is a very beautiful spot, showing off skills, developing skills, relaxing, lots of fresh air, which we've needed during these COVID times, and physical exercise. The whole idea of gardening for health has become very strong in recent years. So much so that the National Garden Scheme here in the UK have commissioned a report a few years back, and they came out with certain conclusions. It was a 60-page report, quite long, but it was very clear that regular gardening can reduce mental health problems and depression and anxiety, reduce stress, even bring down blood pressure, and certainly make you fit. Its recommendations was that doctors should prescribe gardening for stress relief, and perhaps that would be a lot better than having all the pills that we're given from doctors these days. It's interesting hearing about this idea of forest bathing in Japan. It seems to be a new thing that people are doing. There's a book here all about it. And it's going into the forest, not because you want to exercise or jog or hike through it, but to actually take in the forest through our senses. Developing conscious awareness, based on our sight, our hearing, taste, smell, touch, all these things, becoming really aware of nature and enjoying the forest. It certainly makes you much healthier mentally. So it's a method of bridging the gap between ourselves and the natural world. I think we're getting that sort of feeling since COVID here in the UK, judging by the thousands of visitors we've had to the garden recently. Well, the other thing is impermanence, which is certainly something you have to come to terms with when you're gardening. Part of our garden has this wonderful 80-foot cliff, which you can climb onto the top of. The views are wonderful and very extensive, but it's a big solid piece of limestone to one side of the quarry, and quite magnificent. And I did some research on this, and someone told me, I think it was Wikipedia actually, on the internet, that this particular rock, which is called Hopton Wood limestone, originating as many as 2 billion years ago. We have bits of rock all over the place in the garden, which we try to reuse, but you can see we also have a lot of fossils in these rocks, quite unusual, some of them. And in fact, one of the fireplaces in Cascade's house is actually made from polished Hopton wood limestone, with the patterning that you see on the left-hand photograph. Certainly something very solid in the garden, and it soaks up the heat during the day and radiates it out in the evening. Well, certainly I've had to learn all about plants, and the fact that, quite simply, a little bit like human beings, you've got to get into the right place. You've got to put a plant into somewhere that it likes to be, and so it can thrive. So dahlias, for example, can't cope with frost. They like sunny, fertile soil. The hostas, which we've mentioned before, thrive in semi-shade and moist soil. A bit like human beings, isn't it, really, about getting the right opportunity to thrive. Lots more plants here. Conifers we have in our sunny, rocky borders. The ferns all get put into the woodland area where it's shady. Grass is like dry, sandy soil. And there's that beautiful iris, which is on the water margins of our streams and ponds. One of the things that I've also realized is that every plant has its moment. And I say this to people quite often because, of course, things start to grow and develop. And then just that one day in particular, then it's just perfect. And nature is in all its glory. And this piece of lilac here, this lilac bush, is just wonderful. And I love this photograph. Chrysanthemums. And one of my favorite flowers, and we have thousands of them in the grounds, is this wonderful double hellebore. These are the plants that tend to come out very early in February into March, and we open the garden, in fact, on the 1st of March deliberately because we have such a wonderful display of these flowers, even though most other plants haven't yet come into leaf. And another, a modern peony. We have lots of blood red and white peonies, but this peony, Bowl of Beauty, just breathtakingly beautiful. But it just was perfect for a few days, and then sadly it declines. A beautiful rhododendron. And yet more hellebores. This lovely double one of the first things to come out in the garden this year. But it's not just flowers. Suddenly I found this rotting log on one corner of the garden, and it was just for a day or two, had this lovely set of toadstools. It was just perfect, and I was really taken by that, and I thought just how wonderful nature is and how perfect that was for that time. A year later, I took the same log, the photograph, and it was quite transformed. Still attractive in a natural way, but that moment had gone. So nature can be wonderful and beautiful, but it's not always kind to us. And plants can look less than their best and stressed and unhappy. But also gardeners have to watch the weather because working time and things you can do in the garden are entirely dependent on the weather. And of course, plants need rain as well as sunshine. We have to learn that nature is actually our master. With the very inclement weather we've had and some of even the flooding here in Derbyshire, we realize that nature's in control, and we realize that things are impermanent. They do come and go, and we have to tolerate that and be patient. Well, here's a sad example this spring. You may have heard that April had the worst frost in history. And this tree that you see in front of the house was about to become, just early April, it was about to become the most beautiful flowering magnolia with lovely white flowers. It's been grown there for more than 20 years. But within a day, the frost had killed every flower, and it was just brown, as you can see, and very sad. I'm glad to say that 2 or 3 months later, the leaves have returned, so we're hopeful for next year. Another things I can almost tears in my eyes if I tell you this story. We have a large, one of the large ponds at the end of the garden. Suddenly a mother duck appeared and produced this little 6, I think it was, little ducklings on the pond, and all the children were thrilled to see them and so on. But within a few weeks, they were gradually disappearing, and eventually there was only one little duckling left. And we're not quite sure what happened to Mother Duck and the siblings, but I think you could probably imagine in this natural setting. The happy side of this story is that one duck survived, and it's now almost as big as the duck on the right. I just discovered that a couple of days ago. So nature's got a way of giving, but also taking away. Well, we talked about patience, but also perfection and that loveliness of when plants are right. There's another story that I grew this lovely yucca plant on the side of the cliff, at the bottom of the cliff. And I looked after it and I tended it and watered it. It was in a sort of a crevice in the rocks. And gradually it grew and grew. And 20 years later, one year, there was a burst of sunshine and this beautiful flower appeared. We were so thrilled about that, 20 years in the making. And then a month later, we had a very dry spell and the whole thing died and hasn't come back. So yes, patience certainly, but also coping with the loss of such a lovely plant. I spent a lot of my time growing from seed. This is in my potting shed. And it's just amazing watching seeds grow and seeing them grow and develop. And well, it's the miracle of nature, isn't it? Green shoots are the very essence of life. And here we are in the shed there, seedlings turning into cut and also into plants. And I take a lot of cuttings. It's amazing what you can do if you put a cutting in a pot. Really good feeling seeing plants grow. Well, during lockdown for COVID last year, I'm sure we were all rather bored, weren't we, and needed something to do. I decided it was time to start looking at the practice of bonsai. You may know that this all started in Japan in the 12th century, and it became an occupation, a cult that cultivating miniature trees in small pots. Also landscapes. It actually started with landscapes with multiple trees and moss and rocks and so on, but gradually it came down to individual trees. The tree you see here is a little Japanese 10-year-old crabapple tree. It has wonderful blossom and crab apples during the year. It was about being harmonious with nature, being one with nature. Well, the famous bonsai man here in the UK is called Peter Chan. He has a lot of YouTube videos and has written a number of books. And certainly I found him very helpful learning how to do bonsai. I put a quote from him there. Bonsai is not just about gardening, but it's actually art and spirituality combined with horticultural techniques. And certainly I found it a very moving experience watching these plants developing. Challenge for enthusiasts forever striving for horticultural and aesthetic excellence. So a never-ending quest for perfection. I'm not sure I've got enough patience. I have to develop more patience to prune all the trees I've got. I've got about 50 trees now. And you can see in the very early stages a year ago, here's some of the trees that I started to develop. Any outdoor tree or shrub can be bonsai'd, but of course it does take a number of years to get them going. And this was right at the beginning when I first started last year. We've opened a bonsai shop for visitors with all the pots and tools and things like that. And I've tried to find things that will not only miniaturize and grow, but have flowers or fruits at the same time. So here's a pyracantha there, actually with the fruits, even though I've stripped it back into a more bonsai shape. Another pyracantha that's going to come out in berries. Interesting, the trunk and the root formation. Of course, everyone loves acers, and Acer palmatum are much sought after. That's a Japanese holly on the right-hand side. It's a 10-year-old tree. Needs to be trimmed, but I find everyone's interested in acers. This is a lovely greeny, yellowy one, and then the traditional purple leafed acer. I discovered that bonsai, the Japanese think of it, if you're going to be successful in bonsai horticulture, you've got to be true to yourself, be good, and enjoy the beauty of it all. And so these are the fundamental principles of bonsai: truth, goodness, and beauty. And the idea is not to make it obvious that you're trimming the tree, and you try to do it in a very natural way, so it's not obvious that a human's been involved. And the daily care of bonsai, looking at them, caring for the plants, trimming them carefully with patience, it's a meditative and reflective time for the practitioner. Here's another 10-year-old tree. This is a little hornbeam, of course, isn't it? And quite intricate, rather nice. That's taken 10 years to get to that point. Of course, some of the trees in Japan are 500 years old. Sadly, I don't think my trees are going to get that far. One of the most exciting things of gardening is the renewal every spring. And being in tune with the seasons is very much something that every gardener has to come to terms with. Starting in autumn, the autumn color cascades is extraordinary. I've been planting trees that are relevant to colorful autumn for 25 years. And of course, you do start with this, having had a lovely summer, everything starts to decline and decay. And it does remind us of our mortality. Wonderful colors, these reds and yellows and oranges. This is our beech copse. And looking up the hillside, we've now created a walkway so that you can view back into the limestone quarry, but also get amongst the trees. Winter can be spectacular at Cascades. We're 800 feet up in the hills of Derbyshire, and it can get quite icy, and yet somehow rather beautiful. So the winter is all about death and survival. It's also a time to reflect and start to plan for the spring. Here's the house after a snow in February. And we do get lots of snow. Well, there we are. So we certainly do get plenty of weather throughout the winter up here in the hills of Derbyshire. But in common with another famous gardener, Monty, he's a great one for spring, and he gets almost depressed in the winter. He tells us, can't wait for that first few weeks in May when everything starts to come back to life, and he celebrates the regrowth and renewal of plants. And I have to say the first weekend of May is certainly my favorite time, when everything starts to burst into life, when the leaves develop, the rebirth of a year. And one of the first things that happens in the spring is this wonderful Japanese tree here, the Prunus taihaiku. It's a lovely double white blossom. And it's all about recovery and rebirth. And it's a wonderful, invigorating time. Spirits lift. This gives you an impression of the quarry area. Blossoms starting to come with forsythia. The lawn starts to become green again, and so on. And yes, we get lots of daffodils and the beginning of the roses. Well, summer, we've just started our summer with a vengeance after a week or two of heavy rain. Everything is coming into flower. And I just love the flowers all coming out, and the color is just glorious. It gives an energy to the garden and to ourselves. Here's the long border along the mill race. Quite a pleasure to see, but quite a responsibility to weed. And June, as we're just in now, this is exactly how the rose border looks at the moment, along rose border along the bottom of the cliff. Quite glorious. Well, we have to cope with uncertainty as gardeners, and you never quite know what's going to happen. In fact, this morning, as flood warden of my village, I got a warning of thunderstorms that we were supposed to be getting later today. We shall see. Certainly, we've had our fair share of uncertainty and storms. Here's and you can see through our nursery coming through there, the water underneath causing a bit of havoc. And over the years now, we've started to develop flood defenses, and 20 foot up on one side of the garden, there is this mill race that used to feed water to the mill, the corn mill. And we always were getting this overflow, spoiling the garden. And so we decided to create these steps. And they really work, because after a heavy rain, a storm, that's what they can look like. Amazing. But it takes the pressure off that waterway along the top of the garden and stops it spoiling, gets down into a stream and off into the drains around the house. This is a waterfall in Cascades that's very close to our front door. And it's a beautiful waterfall. Quite powerful at times. Actually, in Storm Dennis last year, this was one of the worst storms we'd had for many years. This is how it looked. It was quite scary. So we're not called Cascades for nothing. We certainly have waterfalls and issues with water. The other thing that we develop as gardeners is a responsibility, of course, for nature, because we need to take care of the wildlife and the plants in our care. And we go out of our way to be organic. We don't use chemicals. The only bit of spraying we do sometimes is on the paths when they get a bit weedy, but we don't get anywhere near plants and so on. We tend to remove weeds by hand as best as we can. You can see our recycling area. We have lots of big compost bins where the tons of leaves are put every year from all those beech trees that you saw. We create a wonderful leaf mold that goes back onto the borders. And we do try to recycle all the materials that we find around the garden. We found tons and tons of different stones. And whenever we make something with timber, we keep bits and reuse them. All the plants are split and divided when we change a border. And where we can, we try to plant for wildlife. And we thought about that quite a bit. And this is what I mean. The buddleias that we have many of, the butterflies just love them. And the bees, you have to look after the bees if you're going to create good plants. And I think we probably have all the British birds in the garden at some time or another. You can see the list of them here, from the very tiniest wrens and robins up to some of the biggest hawks and buzzards. So it's a glorious place for bird song. And whenever I do a talk on gardening, everyone says, well, how do you have such wonderful hostas, as you see here? Well, I have a little bit of help from an army of toads that live in the garden and the various ponds, and I think they keep the slugs at bay. I've certainly found gardening to be a very creative experience. And just creating different borders, pot gardens and so on has been quite rewarding, and then watching things grow. And I think that gardening is all about our part in taking part in the cycle of existence, becoming co-creators of the universe. And it's our responsibility to do our bit to make the world as good a place as we could, as natural and healthy as we can make it. Flower arrangement. And some of our borders. Beautiful effect with blues and whites, tall plants, the verbascums and delphiniums. Well, we had a famous gardener in the 1990s called Jeff Hamilton here in the UK. He was a great one for getting close to nature. He understood the idea that it was a way of refreshing the soul. He had a series of programs on the BBC. I remember watching them, videos, and he was absolutely clear. His message was, look, we can all have our little bit of garden somewhere. We can all create our own paradise. Find a corner if you're in a courtyard, on a roof, in a city, whatever. Create a little space where you can sit, relax, and be surrounded by plants and nature. And I was very taken by this idea of paradise gardens. In fact, one of my later talks is about that subject, paradise gardens around the world. And I certainly think that at Cascades we have our own taste of paradise. Those snowy February days when the snow is fresh, absolutely gorgeous, quite breathtaking. I have to take the pictures before the kids come out and play snowballs. But in the summer, the lush planting that we have here at Cascades, wonderful. The senses we have now at the garden at the moment, the colour, the greenness. Certainly my little daughter here thinks it's paradise. And here's a very recent photograph looking back at the end of the garden to one of our seats. You can see it's just blissful. Well, most of my latter life, I've wrestled with this concept from Japan of being one with nature. And certainly, Japanese gardens give you an interesting and spiritual feeling. There's no doubt about that. And that's why so many people in the UK have a little corner of the garden that they want it to be Japanese. We have a Japanese garden here in Derbyshire. Actually, it's just on the edge of Lincolnshire by Newark. And there's a Japanese monk who's created a 2-acre garden with pools and carp and all that sort of thing, the things that we think of as Japanese in gardens. I went over there and we had a cup of tea and a good chat, swap notes and so on. And he makes a jolly good cup of tea and scones, would you believe? That's interesting for a Japanese monk. He wrote me a poem. He said, well, just as a flower, human beings are beautiful, being nature. And that really struck home with me. And I led to quite a lot of research about this concept of being nature, that we are all made of the same stuff. We're all part of the same thing in the universe. And it's led me to reading a lot about this sort of thing in atomic physics. But I mean, very clear that with meditation, that feeling of being one with nature can be achieved, not least because when you're sitting in a very natural place or garden, you get this sense of harmony and balance. And it really makes you feel very restful, very peaceful. And the guests that we have here absolutely feel that. And they also feel an energy in the garden, which is very positive. So I recommend everyone to sit in your garden where you can, or find a nice natural place, connect with nature, and this can reduce your stress, improve your mental capacity, and so on. It grounds you, brings you down to earth. And sitting on our cliffside in the woodland, very natural, and so on. Well, harmony and balance is something that's really been a lesson for me. And I've felt that in the garden. And I've realized that nature has a way, even where there are weeds, not natural horticultural aspects and plants, but there are weeds that can actually be glorious and flowering and just give you that feeling of a balanced setting. Even there, one of the plants here, one of the guests recently said, she was Danish and very interesting. She said, looking at your garden, it's beautiful and soothing with gifts for your eyes in every corner. And every sight shows you that nature is the great creator of harmony and balance. I was really taken by that, and it taught me a lot. And certainly when you look at the pictures of Cascades, you get that feeling of a very natural setting, a place to meditate. Lots of seats in nice settings. Winding pathways, let your mind drift. Quiet corners with water, sound of water everywhere. And lots of dappled shade to keep you cool on a hot summer's day. So in summary, I believe very much that it's that sense of harmony and balance in the garden that gives us peace of mind. And I recommend it. Come to Cascades. It's the perfect place to meditate. Well, I hope you can manage to see us, even if you're in Sri Lanka one day. Come and visit the garden or take a retreat. We're now doing retreats in our B&B. We have an extensive website, cascadesgardens.com, and I have a blog and video, Garden for Wellbeing. we've started doing retreats using our bed and breakfast and the garden. And we are doing regular monthly retreats, secular retreats, in mindfulness and meditation. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this talk. I've deliberately done a series of 5 because I think there's a lot more to say about nature and spirituality. Through my life, I've visited a lot of wonderful gardens around the world, particularly in Japan, China, and Spain and India. And I've got a talk on that. This whole idea of being one with nature and my practice in mindfulness and meditation and using bonsai. There's a talk on that. And also then we've got one about how to make a sacred garden. And then finally, my own spiritual awakening over the recent years as Cascades Gardens have developed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan. We have actually a lot of questions. So maybe, Dil, would you like to go ahead and ask your question first? Maybe it would be better if they speak and ask related questions. You would have to unmute yourself first, Dil.
All right. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Right. Okay. So thank you very much for a really wonderful talk. It brought the beauties of nature and also the association with harmony and about peace and rejuvenation and impermanence and all the other things that you highlighted, which I think rings very much with all of us who are following Bhante on the teachings. Your garden is beautiful. So I am a member of both RHS and other things like National Trust, and visit gardens often. I live in London. In your own garden, I saw the beauty of it because it combined the beauties in summer. Coming from a tropical country, we don't generally always go, at least I don't like winter very much, so we visit the gardens mainly in summer, but you showed me how beautiful your garden was with the ice cascades. So thank you for the wonderful experience. My question, which I thought, and which has really taken me away from gardening, it has been put on the chat by other members as well. It's about slugs and snails. 4 years ago, I actually retracted from looking after the garden to the extent that we did, because I first got my husband to put the snail bait, but he quickly got wise to it. In about 6 months, he said, I'm stopping this and you better do it. And we both stopped. And with that, a lot of interest in our gardens. We found all our hostas were ruined. Even putting them up on pots and lifting them up on little feet didn't help. And we then took them onto the patio. It was only a question of time before they got at them. Also, our garden became very boring because we had to find plants that what we asked people. So it's full of geraniums because they don't get at them, and a few others that we have got with other shrubs and foliage. So I would really like to ask you, we don't want to put beer and all the rest of the pesticides and snail bait and things. I know you mentioned toads. I have a little pond. It doesn't have toads occasionally, but there are frogs that come at an appropriate time, but that doesn't keep the slugs away. So others have asked a question. I would really like to ask you, what are the plants? First of all, how do you keep them away other than toads away from, and the question about the weeds as well from the garden, the common weeds, would be grateful. And the plants that are normally not delicacies for the snails and slugs. Very grateful. I think others have expressed the same. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, we've tackled the hosta problem, but there are 2 things. One is I grow a lot of them in pots. And if you buy a pot that has a lip on the top there, so the slugs can't climb up the pot under that little lip. And so you can do quite perfect hostas in pots. That's the first thing, because it's inevitable that at some point, some part of your garden is going to get slugs and snails, even ourselves. But I promise you that we do have a lot of ponds. And one year I noticed that the frog spawn, which is usually a sort of a gelatinous blob, isn't it? Toad spawn is actually strings of that gel. with the babies in, and I suddenly realized that actually we have more toads than frogs, and that's what I put it down. I think we've got a degree of eco-balance after 25 years of gardening. 90% of our hostas don't get eaten, even in the gardens. I do believe we've got an army of toads, and I do recommend that's the best thing you can use. Otherwise, you have to go back to something like slug pellets or something which you don't really want to do.
Thank you. And plants which you would say are not very favorable, what would you recommend to get eaten? I mean, I have 3 or 4 things that I use, but is there something that you found in your experience that they're normally bothered much by slugs? And
well, we know that it's easier, of course, to talk about which ones are. I mean, the fresh young delphiniums always get eaten by slugs if you're not careful, as well as the hostas and so on. But you know, there are lots of other things that they hate. Some, you know, shrubs and so on have more flowering shrubs. But there's some truth in the fact that if the plant is very healthy, maybe the slugs don't go for it quite so much. It tends to be the ones that are struggling a bit.
Okay, because I think we know the delphiniums and the hosta, the things that they just, the cannas and lots of other plants which they really go for. But the daisies, practically all the flowers that come up later on, the tulips don't, so they stay, and the hyacinths don't as spring comes up, so they are quite good there. But subsequently, when the other plants come, and the roses generally, they don't go because of, but the clematis, most of the others that I know, the flowering ones, they get very quickly ripped off, and after 2 or 3 years, I've just stopped them. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jill. I think Don has a question. Don, please, you may ask.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you very much for your presentation. Just to say that I also volunteer at a local initiative where I live, where gardening is taught particularly to deal with mental health issues. And it is one of the most successful projects that I have been involved with. But my concern is, of course, maybe this is not something that is valid for Derbyshire because you have very high rainfall patterns.
Yes.
But my concern is living in other areas where there may be lower rainfall patterns and where the possibilities of water not reaching the levels. I am planning to transition my garden at the moment into a more place where they would be less dependent on water. What would be the added value in Zen gardening if this is to be done?
Well, we've just been creating some new areas. I showed the picture of the development of that raked gravel garden. I realized at the beginning of the year that the worst place in the garden with the worst weeds and the most difficulty to grow anything decent because it was shady and didn't get the right conditions. We converted it to a Japanese style karasansui, a dry stone garden. So I think that doing some of the Japanese approaches with rocks and gravel could be the answer if you have a dry garden.
And how do you deal with weeds, for instance? What is is there a Zen way of dealing with weeds, or do you have to just simply pluck them and root them out?
Well, I wish I could meditate and all the weeds would go away. We both know that the only way of getting rid of weeds properly is to actually get down to the plant with a little fork and pull them all up by the roots. And if you don't get the roots out, you will get them back very quickly. No, quite frankly, we have to have quite good standard gardeners here who understand what weeding means, and we do it all by hand. And of course, we never use chemicals. So no, I think it's just hard work, but I think people get a lot of satisfaction out of weeding by hand.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Don. Thank you. Anyone else who would like to ask any questions? And up until we do have some questions come in, Alan, could you clearly, I mean, what is the difference between gardening and Zen gardening? You know,
Well, I mean, I thought very carefully about whether to use the term Zen gardening, because it was really just to capture people's imagination. Simply the fact that I've tried to use Japanese principles of gardening to develop my own English garden. I'm not trying to be purely Japanese, but you know, it's about sitting. It's about being in a natural spot. It's about lack of symmetry. It's about no straight lines. It was about winding paths and clipped conifers, lovely, the sound of water. So I've tried to use all these principles. Borrowing the landscape is another thing that the Japanese gardens do. So, and I've worked with the landscape and the cliffs and the rocks very carefully. So when I talk about Zen gardening, I simply mean using the principles of Japanese gardens to enhance our own English gardens.
okay, understood, understood. Would there be anyone else who would like to ask any questions or even add some insights into that they've learned from their own gardens to further enrich the session?
I'd like to just find out, you have a high carbonate soil because you have been planting on a limestone quarry.
Yes.
Did you have to prepare the soil in order to grow all these various varieties that you have planted? Because I noticed that you also use a lot of grasses like the festucas, the carexas,
Yes.
and so on.
Yes, we do. Well, it is a limestone soil. Interestingly enough, the other side of the hill, it's acid soil, and there's a wonderful rhododendron garden there. So we can't grow rhododendrons except in pots. We tend to go for hydrangeas instead. Of course, hydrangeas then tend to be red when they're in a lime soil. We've just had to find plants that enjoy lime soil. It's not terribly lime, so I think we're getting away with planting many and most things. But of course, it's been a trial and error over 25 years. I think my biggest problem has been cold, wet winters, not the soil.
Anything else on that regard, Don? All clear?
No, I think that's very clear. I'll leave it time for others to ask any questions.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So I think that there are no more questions, Alan. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and you've given some very good insights for our gardeners here to go back and, help their own gardens. All right. So yes.
Bhante, can I just, following up from Don's question, so those plants that need ericaceous soil, like the magnolias, the camellias, rhododendron, so they are mainly acid-loving plants. And you had some beautiful rhododendrons, and you have limey soil. I couldn't quite. Wow.
They're mostly in pots. Mostly in pots.
Right.
We have managed to get one or two to flower in the woodland, because I think we're not very limestone. We're not very far away from.
And you mentioned you had hydrangeas. So I have a lot of hydrangeas. They tend to be, I live in London, the soil is more limey there. So it's more alkaline. And we have them on the ground and in pots as well. But even if I buy the blues, I find that a couple of years they will, in pots, that they will become blue. But as soon as I put them in the soil, they will become pink. So I have to sort of either keep them in pots and use, there's a colorant that you can buy to keep them in blue. Is that your experience as well?
Well, hydrangeas will go blue or red depending on the soil.
Yeah.
So if you keep them, if you put a blue one into a lime soil, it'll go red. If you put a red one into ericaceous compost in a pot, it'll go blue. Yeah. So that's just a fact of nature, really.
Okay, thank you very much.
Ala, you have a question for us?
One small comment, Bhante, Mr. Clements. Instead of using slug pellets, for the last few years, we have been using eggshells. We crush the eggshells and put them across around the plant. And that has been shown to ward off the slugs because they can't walk over eggshells. It has helped us.
Yes, it's a tried and tested method. But of course, when you have a hosta bed that's 40 foot long and 10 foot wide, you'd have to use a lot of eggs.
We use it for our slender plants, like small sunflower plants and things like that. Not very huge ones, yeah.
Yes, yes. No, it's a good idea for a small area. That's fine.
Wonderful.
Does wood chips also help? Some people recommend pine needles and wood chips. Is that a deterrent? I
think fresh pine wood chips would deter them, but of course they gradually rot down, don't they? So, and that would encourage them more than ever.
Alan, there seems to be more interaction about gardening than in my Dharma classes, Alan.
I have to say, I do a lot of talks on gardening, and the slug thing always comes up. Always comes up.
Yes.
Bhante, we could combine them by having a retreat conducted by you in this beautiful garden with its B&B, suggestion for non-COVID times.
Yes, Alan and myself, we are planning on something for the future. Padma, you have a question, Padma.
Thank you for a beautiful talk. I was asked, want your advice on fertilizer. I mean, I'm sure you must be using natural fertilizer most of the time, but any tips for small gardens that we had sometimes use synthetic fertilizer?
Well, if you can use an organic fertilizer, that's great, providing it's not too costly. My advice is more about you do use fertilizer when you can and when you have time, because it does make such a difference to pot plants in particular and other areas. So yes, do use organic fertilizers if you can.
Okay, thank you.
I noticed your lawns, gardens are beautifully green. I think part of it is the climate there. But here in London, do you advise for us to buy lawn feed, or if so, what is a particularly good one? Because some of them are really not very good.
I'm not quite sure what you said. Do I advise what?
To keep the lawns nice and green. I
Yes.
notice yours are beautiful. A part of it is the climate in London that we have, but I'm sure you must be using something to keep them looking so fresh and green. So do you advocate any kind of lawn feed?
Well, two points here. Firstly, because my garden is semi-shade and quite moist, I never get a brown lawn, for example, so they never dry out. Once a year, I do, in fact, I've slightly misled you here. I do sometimes use this, something like a feed and weed from Miracle Grow or something like that, where it will not only freshen up and fertilize the grass and make it a better color, but also kill off some of the weeds. So I do that from time to time.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions that anyone would like to ask? All right, Alan, I think we don't have any more questions. Alan, should we give an outline of what we plan to do next month for the series?
Yes, I've actually forgotten which is the second one. I think that's, as I remember, the second talk is about my travels around the world. And so I've got quite some wonderful photography of Japanese gardens and even some Chinese gardens and Muslim gardens in places like India and Spain. I haven't been to Iran. So it's quite an interesting tour of sacred gardens, if you like. And I go revisit Jeff Hamilton's idea about paradise gardens, not least in Iran, where I've researched gardens there. and where we touch on a little bit of feng shui.
Lovely, lovely. And we were also planning for a little bonsai workshop in the future as well.
I hope that will be in the 4th one.
Yes, very much within the series. So that might be quite exciting for participants here. Thank you so much, Alan, for all the knowledge that you have shared. I mean, you have decades of experience and you've literally converted your garden into something so beautiful that is visited, and people buy tickets to visit your garden and all of that, which is absolutely incredible. Thank you so much, Alan, for coming over and sharing your insights with the community, and we are looking forward to having you with us in the future, Alan. Thank you so much.
I'm glad to be with you.
Lovely. And thank you to everyone else who has taken the time to come in and join. Please do join in on the future sessions as well. If you have not already subscribed to receive updates on all the sessions that we offer through the Dharma Center, do visit www.dharmacenter.uk and subscribe to the newsletter. Also, take a look at Alan's website, Cascade Gardens. If you all the details and signpost to Alan's website is on the Dharma Center website as well, under guest speakers Alan Clements, and you can all the signposting is there. Alan does have an Airbnb, and also in the future we will also be holding retreats together with Alan at Cascades Garden for those of you who would be interested in that. So thank you very much. And a reminder about tomorrow's session, we have the Bollywood actor Gagan Malik coming in, who played the role of Siddhartha Gautama, who will be interviewed by Anoma Vathaladeniya tomorrow upon his inspirations that made him become a philanthropist, activist for Buddhism in India, and his work with the Ambedkar Foundation and India after playing the role, being motivated by the role of Siddhartha Gautama. So that is happening tomorrow at 1 p.m. Details about that is also available up on our website. Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you, everyone else. Have a lovely, pleasant rest of the weekend. Take care and goodbye.